A few years ago, I went on a trip to Tibet, and since then, I've learned more about the kingdom of Zhengzhung. And this kingdom is a mysterious, long forgotten kingdom which is only just being brought to light now as the Chinese are beginning to slowly trickle out archaeological reports. I'll go into more detail explaining it, but in this video, I want to separate as much as I possibly can the religious and folkloric aspects of the kingdom of Zhengzhung with the factual, historic aspects, although I'll discuss a little bit about this at the end of the video. Now, essentially, what you need to know is that Tibetans often portray themselves as being the sole and original inhabitants of the Tibetan plateau, and they don't like to, or not that they don't like to, but when they mention the kingdom of Zhengzhung, people see it as a sort of cultural expression. But in reality, Zhengzhung did exist, and I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about archaeology. Now, archaeology is discouraged in many regimes because it causes people to question the narrative of history put forward by the powers that be. In some regimes, archaeology is encouraged only as an extension of the state. This is what led to the conclusion in Azerbaijan that many of the mass graves were actually of Azeris rather than of Armenians during the Armenian genocide, or led North Koreans to believe that their Korean emperor was buried on the outskirts of Pyongyang with a unicorn. And with many eyes on Tibet during the 2008 Olympic uprising, the discussion has revolved around politics and ethnicity. What the common narrative is now is that the Tibetans are the original inhabitants, they're sort of like indigenous people, and that they were the first ones on the plateau, and the Chinese are acting more or less as colonialists, quite hypocritically because they are communists. Now, this is somewhat true. They are being displaced by ethnic Han Chinese who have cornered the market on the economy in the region, but in reality, there existed a separate political and ethnic structure in this plateau long before the Tibetans came there,
Let me know if you
and
see
this
anything
was
up ahead that I
the
shouldn't be
Zhengzhung
following.
kingdom. And Zhengzhung was ruled not by Tibetan Buddhism, but by a separate religion called Bon, which more closely resembles shamanism. Now, the kingdom of Zhengzhung could be a very deep dive, but I aim to just give a brief historical overview of it. As far back as it goes, a lot of people think that it relates to a culture, the ruins of which were found in the northernmost part of the Tibetan plateau. Now, this part of the plateau in northern Tibetan Autonomous Region is far away from the Himalaya Mountains. It's a very flat land, but elevation-wise, it rises very high. And so there's permafrost there, and discovered were the remains of an Iron Age culture, which many people believe relates to the kingdom of Zhengzhung. It could have been the origin of the kingdom of Zhengzhung, and considering that many of the tribes in the region were, and continued until very recent times, to be nomadic, this is a very real possibility. But regardless of where the kingdom of Zhengzhung came from, we know that it existed in the region of what is now around Kashmir, India, Pakistan, and Chinese borders. Ancient Tibetan writings talk about the mysterious kingdom of Zhengzhung, calling them the rulers of all of central and western Tibet. Their shamanistic religion, Bon, is still practiced to this day in very isolated regions around the world, and mainly within Tibet, often as sort of a accompanying factor of Tibetan Buddhism, which is accentuated by the deification of sort of deities and idols. You know, you have the idea that there are gods which live within mountains and guard over villages and within the streams and the oceans. And this is not shared by all Buddhists, but is shared by many Tibetan Buddhists. Now, in Tibetan religion and folklore, it's said that Zhengzhung's kingdoms were divided into three regions, like how Tibet nowadays is seen as three provinces. Ba, or the outer, Pa, the inner, and Ba, the middle. The outer is what we might call Western Tibet nowadays, from Gilgit, Pakistan to the west to Dangsra Kyung Rong in the east, next to Lake Namso, and from Khotan in the north to Tumig Bratsu, Ranis in the south. The inner region is often said to be Tanzig, often identified with the historic region of Bactria, and the middle Gyamar Bochad, a place that has not yet been identified. The true size of their kingdom is now a mystery. We can surmise from early writings about them that it covered a vast region of what is now Tibet, if not the majority of Tibet. And we can also surmise that their capital was at a place called Kyunglung, the ruins of which we have found and know exist. And we can also see that they had a grip over trade within the region because their capital was close to the rivers which provided easy access for what is now India, Pakistan, and China. Now back to the ruins of Kyunglung. These are incredibly mysterious, and they're on the banks of the river Sutlej, crossing through what is now Tibet, India, and Pakistan, directly north of the Himalaya Mountains, passing all the way through the country, or now the autonomous region of Tibet, meaning easy access and trade to all of these regions many, many centuries ago, well over 1,000 years. And these ruins aren't far from the modern town of Tirthapuri, which is famous for a gompa and hot springs, which are actually just outside of their village. The site is characterized as caves, altars, and ancient ruins situated very close to the temple of the Bon religion, which still understands their importance. The fact that there is a temple of Bon to this ancient Kyunglung capital is a fascinating thing to point out because it forms within China, which has a policy of state atheism, especially being in these remote, isolated regions where it can't be exploited for tourists. Now, the ruins of Kyunglung, with almost no exception, are 4 meters by 4 meters caves cut into the side of a mountain with a small altar at the far end and no hole in the ceiling for smoke to leave. This would have made the whole room fill with smoke, which bellowed out the door and is almost unseen outside of this culture. It was very commonly understood, even back to the Stone Age, that you needed to vent smoke. Inside of these caves, archaeologists and explorers find an ancient Tibetan script, statues of Bon deities, and even modern offerings of feathers and ash indicating that they are still sacred to the Bon practitioners, and especially probably the ones at the temple that is just outside of the ruins. But why exactly the capital was built here is still a mystery. There's very little fresh water, few springs, and the springs that exist are barely potable, and only a very polluted river a good distance away, this river providing easy access, but not easy drinking water. Most settlements at the time would have consisted of a community scattered around a spring which provided clean drinking water, and Kyunglung does not fit this description, at least not as far as we know. Maybe this spring evaporated, but the Chinese authorities are making it difficult to research archaeology. Gerugam is a few miles away, another set of ruins, and this appears to have been permanently inhabited. Perhaps mysterious Kyunglung ruins were the religious center, often seen as a magician theater where people would go as shamans to practice Bon religion, and Gerugam would have been the capital, but this is unknown to this day. We don't really know what happened here because, again, the Chinese authorities, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, have not been forthcoming with this research. Now, these two ruins occur very close to each other, and in fact, the word Kyunglung translates to the Silver Palace of Garuda, and Garuda would be similar, or at least sound similar, to the word Gerugum. And Garuda would have held immense spiritual importance to the inhabitants of this region and to all later inhabitants, because Garuda is described as the vehicle mount for the Hindu god Vishnu. The Buddhists also consider Garuda to be the protector of the Dharma, and the Jain associate Garuda with a sort of natural spirit or the spirit of nature, and they're often portrayed as a protector over the spirits, which are called yaksha. Now, I might be butchering some of this folklore. I'm more interested in Tibetan Buddhism, but this is tying in with the formation of all of these religions, and Bon would have been the shamanistic, back to the Stone Age religion that would have predated all other religions in the Himalaya Mountains, and possibly all other religions within Asia itself. And this would be a good place to begin my mythology lesson here. It's noteworthy that within the Bon religion, there are claims that this area, the kingdom of Zhengzhung, was founded by a Buddha-like figure, although it wasn't Buddha himself, named Tonpa Shenrab Miwoche 18,000 years ago, and that from this, Tibet sprung up. It's also said that Miwoche, some 18,000 years ago, visited the land which is now Tibet from a place called Tanzig Olmo Lungring, or Shambhala. With the scattered understanding that I have of the Bon religion, it seems to suggest that this Buddha-like figure arrived from Shambhala and founded the Zhengzhung kingdom 18,000 years ago. later leaving to found a separate kingdom in Tibet, but retreating back to Zhengzhung, which really just perpetuated the image that was of Shambhala. And they believe that this kingdom was a pure place, a place of the shaman Bon religion, and a place
It's one
which
of those
really
terms.
seeded this spiritual culture throughout all of Asia, the entire subcontinent, and filled the Vedic religion with spirituality in a sense of sort of understanding. Now, practitioners of the Bon religion, Bonpos, suggest that during this time, Lord Miwoche's teachings permeated the entire continent, or at least the subcontinent, and created a seed from which the Vedic religions could spread. And an example of why this might be true is the fact that Mount Kailash, which for all intents and purposes should be very isolated and really out on its own, up on top of the Himalaya mountains, far away from India, and certainly a very, very far pilgrimage, was the center of Zhengzhung culture and also the most sacred mountain in the world to the Hindus. It's also said that the capital of Zhengzhung, being named the Silver Palace of Garuda, would have consisted of, I mean, Garuda in many of the Vedic religions symbolizes the god of Vishnu and the driving god of Vishnu, or is seen as a winged bird. So this flight over the Himalaya mountains would have been considered a journey beyond the world, a really a journey to the roof of the world and right over it. And this religion would have held an incredibly important onus on the fact that there existed something up over those mountains, which was incredibly mysterious. And to this day, Shambhala is portrayed as something which exercises a good deal of control over you without your direct knowledge or oversight of it. Shambhala is the men behind the curtain exercising a benevolent control which enables the happiness of all people. And even though the Bon religion is dying, Bonpos will claim that Hindu teachings, Buddhist teachings, and most of the Vedic religions, including Jainism, center on the teachings of Tonpa Miwoche, and the leader, Lord Miwoche, would have controlled the kingdom of Zhengzhung. And therefore, the Zhengzhung kingdom, which is now long forgotten, would have been the origin point of the Indo-Aryan civilization and of all Vedic religion. And as such, this presents a very complicated ordeal for the Chinese authorities. Now, I've alluded to this several times throughout this video, but Chinese authorities, as well as authorities in any authoritarian regime, find this kind of revelation to be very difficult to control. Chinese authorities, for example, in East Turkestan, unearthed the mummy, which was thousands of years old and is now used as a rallying point for the East Turkestani culture, which claim that person as their own and claim that that constitutes a unique identity because the mummy, which was female, had a separate color of hair and style of cloth, which is entirely different from the Chinese, although nowadays the East Turkestanis and the Chinese look very similar. So what you would have in the kingdom of Zhengzhung, or what used to be the kingdom of Zhengzhung, is a set of history which suggests, or would seem to suggest, that this is the most sacred ground for Hindus, Jainists, Buddhists, shamans, and any of the Vedic religions. And so the region would go from being an already perilous geopolitical area with borders which are constantly shifting, which India, Pakistan, and China all lay claims to, and now the Tibetan exile government lays claim to being a more nationalist religious area, an area which must be fought for tooth and nail for religious conviction, and not simply for a nationalist pro-country, pro-India, or Pakistan conviction. And this is something the Chinese authorities want to avoid. By opening the can of worms on the kingdom of Zhengzhung, they believe that this would open the can of worms, showing that it was the origin and something that really is more than what they want people to make it to be. So they try to hide these facts. And this is why it's only been the last 20 years that information on Garuda or Kyunglung has come to light to Western scientists. And people are still trying to wrap their heads around this mysterious and ancient shaman kingdom that lasted from the Iron Age to around the 7th century, when the Tibetan emperor finally gained a grip over the region and brought it within the empire of Tibet. and the Empire of Tibet is a completely separate history, which I hope to tackle at some point, but it's such a long and complicated history that it should be tackled completely separately.